right, let's sew up this Sophia pencil skirt. First, you're going to iron on your interfacing. If you used sew-on interfacing, you can just baste around all the edges. You want to match your interfacing weight to the weight of your fabric. So if you have a lightweight skirt fabric, you can use lightweight interfacing, medium for medium weight, and a heavy for a heavier duty. I have a corduroy here is my main, and then my lining is a poly lining. So nice and thin on the lining, kind of medium to heavier weight on the main. First, we're going to start out with our darts. Make sure you clearly mark them on the wrong side of your fabric. I like to start at the point and then move up. You're going to make sure your pin goes straight through the line on both sides as you pin your dart together. Always using pins. The only other way you can do this is you can hand baste instead of using pins. Never been one to hand baste unless it's just really tricky fabric. This is corduroy, nice and easy to work with, so I'm just going to use pins. 99% of the time, I just use pins. And just a warning, I'm going to hit this phone stand several more times. I try my hardest not to, but it is right in front of my face, right where I'm trying to work. I'm trying to get you a good view, but also it is directly in the way. So I hit it quite often. But as you can see, I put my pin straight through the line on both sides, making sure those marked lines are right on top of each other. You want to take your time with this, go nice and slow, get it nice and perfect so your darts look really beautiful and even. Make sure you will have one at the very top as well. Actually end up kind of scooting this one down and adding another one. You want to make sure you start off on the top exactly where you want to, or your waistband or your lining facing won't fit exactly right. So make sure you have that top lined up perfectly. Now we're just going to stitch down. I like to use my needle in the center setting, and I also like to make my stitch length a little shorter. I go for a 2. Even though this is pretty heavy fabric, I still put my stitch length down. The reason for that is because when you come off the end of a dart, you want it to be very smooth, or else you're going to get kind of a little pucker at the very bottom of this dart, and you don't want that. Go nice and slow, making sure you're removing your pins just when you have to. I tried to zoom in nice and close for you here. And you're just going to stitch directly on that line. So your stitching should be on the lines on both sides when you open it up. And when you get to here, here's my pin on the mark. You want to come off as smoothly as you can. You don't want to back stitch. You just take a couple of stitches off the end. Mine has an automatic cutter, so I do that. If yours doesn't, you want to leave tails. And then what you're going to do instead of back stitching is just hand tie these darts off. Takes a few seconds, but it's worth it to have a nice smooth ending to your dart. Again, you never want a little pucker at the end, so you just want to come off nice and slowly and smooth, and then instead of back stitching, just hand tie these knots. So basically we're going to do this a lot of more times for the skirt. We have 4 darts in the back and 2 darts on your front. So you're going to be doing a lot of darts on this. Why do we have so many darts? Well, I draft for a curvy figure, and so we have a big difference between our waist and our hip. And so the more darts, I did 4 darts on the back to really get that big difference between the hip and the waist all distributed. And this way too, if you have an even bigger difference, like I have a small waist and a medium hip, so I have to grade a little bit. This is going to make sure your darts are nice and smooth, having more. So that's why I added 4 on the back. So you just repeat it, boom, to the other dart on your back piece, and then you're going to take this to your ironing board and you're going to give them a really good press. This is my main fabric. I tend to always press my darts towards the back on my main fabric. To press a dart, you want to make sure you press along both sides of your stitch line and then over to whichever side you would like, and then press it again from this side. So you want to press it all around and make sure you're pressing this bottom part of the dart very well. So you're just going to repeat the exact same process on your front darts as well, making sure they're marked nice and easy to see on the underside, the wrong side, boop. And you just pin them, stitch them, and press them just like you did on your back darts. The ones on the front are a little bit shorter, but it is exactly the same process. You're going to grab your lining fabric, and guess what? You're going to do some more darts. That's okay. You're getting really good at them. Boop. On my lining, I like to press them towards the center so that they're going the opposite way as my main fabric, just so it doesn't add bulk in the same areas. Now we're actually going to put this together. Now that we have all of our darts sewn up and pressed, we're going to take our front piece. We're going to align our back pieces at the side seams. You should have marked your back hip with a notch to make sure that those are going towards the center back. There's my little notch. That's just to make sure you get the side seams on the side and the center seam on the center. So I'm just going to line them at the top, the bottom, and sew up the side seams. And we're going to do this on the main and the lining. I'm starting with my lining here. And here's my main, so I just repeated the same thing, sewing the side seams. And now we're going to press all of these seams open. And also you're going to grab your lining waistband piece. So whether you're doing the waistband on the main fabric or not, you always have the waistband pieces for the lining. I'm going to stitch down these little side seams. If you are doing the waistband on the main as well, you'll have the waistband in the lining and the waistband in the main. I am doing a no waistband, so I only have it on the lining here. I'm going to stitch the waistband to the lining, and we're just going to align it at the center front, the side seams, and the edges. The waistband is curved a little bit more than the skirt is, so you'll have to ease them in a little bit, but they should be the same along the seam allowance, so you shouldn't need to work too hard to ease them in. The waistband is interfaced while the bottom is not, so if you find that your main skirt is much longer than your waistband, it is probably because your fabric has stretched while the waistband is interfaced and cannot stretch. So if you find that, I would take your main skirt piece and go and give it a really nice good press, and hopefully that will steam it back into its original shape where it is no longer stretched out. Just pinning along here. I'm going to speed it up so I don't bore you too much because I am just pinning. It's nothing tricky here. You can use clips like me or pins. It doesn't matter. Again, you will feel like you're easing a little bit in because the waistband is curved while the top of the skirt is more straight. Now that we're all pinned, we're just going to stitch this with your normal 1/2 inch seam allowance and then give it a good press. I like to press my seam allowance all up towards the waistband. You can do that, or you can press it open. It does not matter. These seams will be hidden between the main and the lining. It's just whatever you prefer. Next step, we're going to sew along the top edge of the main to the lining. So again, I do not have a waistband piece on mine. I did the no waistband option. If you have a waistband on your main, you'll be pinning the waistband to the waistband, the lining to the main. But here, I'm just pinning my main skirt to the lining waistband at the top. They should be exactly the same. Again, if you feel like one is a little bit bigger than the other, especially if you're doing the no waistband, like me. So I have interfacing all on the lining, and I do not have interfacing on my main. If your main feels like it's grown a little bit, take it back to your ironing board, give it a nice press, and make sure it hasn't stretched out at all. They should be exactly the same, so you should not need to, ease or stretch anything like that. Should fit together nicely and neatly. Make sure your darts are pressed which way you want them to be pressed. I like to put a pin or a clip at each dart to make sure it stays how I want it. We're just going to stitch all along this top edge. Take it to the ironing board and give it a nice good press. Now what we're going to do is optional. I do recommend it though. It gives it a nice little hold to your seam allowance. I like to understitch here. So what we're going to do is open it up, put all the seam allowance towards the lining. We're just going to stitch the seam allowance to the lining. So you can see I'm kind of feeling underneath and making sure my seam allowance is all pressed towards the lining. I do it at about 1/8 of an inch away. You can do it 1/4 of an inch, whatever you like the look of. This just helps it lay nicely. It helps the lining not peek out at the top. Gives it a nice little neat finish. It is optional though. You do not need to do this. You can leave it just as it is before with a nice press. Give it one more press, and I accidentally somehow skipped recording this next step. All we're going to do is align it back right sides together and stitch along the bottom edges. As you can see, I've already stitched them there. If you do not have a slit, you're going to stitch all the way across the bottom in one long stitch. If you have a slit like me, you're going to stitch until the slit on both sides. Don't worry about sewing up the slit yet. After you have stitched, then we're going to sew up this slit. You can tell that the lining is much shorter than the main, so we're going to align them at this top point. Then we're going to work our way down to the bottom. The main will wrap back to the underside towards the lining a little bit, and it's going to do that all along the rest of the whole bottom. The lining is shorter than the main across the whole skirt. It does not tuck under on the very slit portion though, right here. So we're going to stitch. If you want a more modest, smaller slit, you can use a small seam allowance here. If you want a more open triangle slit, you can use the full 1/2 inch. I went ahead and used the full 1/2 inch because I love a dramatic slit, so I went for it. If you're worried about it being too open, showing too much skin, you can use a much smaller seam allowance here. I noticed that you couldn't really see my stitching here, so I do correct it in just a minute if you're patient with me. There we go. It's just a normal stitch though. You do want to make sure that you drop your needle at the top to pivot your foot around so you get a nice sharp point at the top. Again, I'm using the full 1/2 inch seam allowance. You don't need to if you are worried about the slit being too open. Okay, once you have stitched up and down that little triangle, what you're going to do is clip into your seam allowances a little bit. So right here, you're going to clip right up to your stitching line, but not through. Then I also like to clip the corners just so they come out nice and sharp. I just clip that corner right off. Again, never through your stitch line, of course. You always want to leave a little bit. You don't want it to become unraveled in there. And then I like to use some pinking shears just to take a tiny bit off because I did use the full seam allowance. If you used a smaller seam allowance, you might skip this since your seam allowance won't be as wide as mine. You do always want to clip up into that corner though, and the corners on the bottom. You can take this out and then you can turn it right sides out and give it a really nice good press. I'm really sorry for hitting this phone holder a million times, y'all. So when you turn it right sides out, what you're going to see is that that main fabric wraps around to the underside just a little bit. I like to do this when fully lining because it gives you a little wiggle room when you're walking around, moving around, and you don't have to worry about your lining kind of peeking out if they were even at the bottom. So it should wrap around to the underside, give you a little safety net, make sure your lining never peeks out. Right, to get these back seams together, what you're going to do is slip your hand through, grab the top and pull it through to the other top on this side. And you're going to pin main to main, lining to lining, and it's going to kind of create a little open circle here. I'm going to stick my hand through one more time to grab along the bottom edge this time, and I'm going to pull it through and pin it again, lining to lining, main to main, pin or clip, and then I'm gonna shake it out a little bit. There we go. And now we kind of have this circle shape, and I'm going to continue to pin lining to lining and main to main. What we're going to do is we're going to stitch, this is the back seam right here, as you can tell from the little back notches, that back center seam. Want to make sure everything's aligning perfectly here. And we're just going to kind of pin around that circle, only main to main and only lining to lining. Then we're going to grab our zipper. I recommend a 7 to 9 inch zipper. I'm tall, so I add an inch from my waist to my hip. I also have a pretty big difference between my waist and my hip. I have a size small waist and a medium hip. I can just barely get by with the 7 inch. If you are normal height and you fit into our chart a little bit better than me, you aren't more curvy than our chart, the 7 inch will probably be perfect for you. If you are like me and you have a really big difference between your waist and your hip where you have to grade to a smaller waist to your hip, you might need the 9 inch. I can get by with it. This is a 7 inch. I can get by with it, but it is quite snug getting it on. I do better with a 9 inch, but you know what? This is the one that I had that matched perfectly, and I will wiggle it on so that my zipper matches perfectly. A little trick of the trade is to quickly hit the zipper tape with a lighter. It'll melt it just a tiny bit. Then I hold it in place, and so it just kind of holds back this extra zipper tape for me, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. You can also baste it in place. I don't like to trim it off personally. I like to fold it back. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find where we want to start our stitching. So I'm going to align the top of the zipper to the very top seam, work my way down, and I'm going to mark where I want my stitching. Personally, I like my stitching to start just above the zipper stop. If you want your zipper stop visible, you can start just below your zipper stop, whichever way you prefer. And make sure you mark that on both sides. Of course, it should be perfectly even, your main and your lining. So what we're going to do is right where I've marked where I want my stitching to start, right here. I'm going to stitch only the lining to the lining, and then I'm going to go down through the bottom and up in kind of a U shape back to that same marking on the main. So we are not going to sew the whole thing. We're going to start right here where we marked it, and I'm going to go down in a U shape up to the same point on the main using that normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to speed this up just a little bit so that I don't bore you. We're just taking a normal old stitch from the marking on the main. We're only sewing lining to lining. Then we're going to go down through, here's the bottom, through what now I'm sewing only main to that same marking point. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to take this to the iron. We're going to press these seam allowances open. I do trim off the notches here. We're going to press these seam allowances open. This is kind of a trickier spot to press, but take your time. And then once you press these seam allowances open, we're going to press the unsewn area at the top 1/2 inch to the wrong side, just like this. So your seam allowance will just kind of continue up, and you're just going to press your seam allowances open just like this on both the main and the lining on all the remaining raw edges. So here it is. I have them right sides out, but I have the lining facing out. So as you can see, it's all pressed under. I'm just kind of aligning everything for you to see. I've pressed them under 1/2 inch. They should all line up beautifully just like this on both sides. I'm going to take our zipper, and we are just going to carefully and meticulously pin it in place in our opening here. I do recommend using pins, not clips here. Can get it nicer and tighter and just a little more accurate. You can also hand baste this as well if you have a trickier fabric or one that won't hold a press. Luckily, both of my fabrics held a press fairly well. So you're just going to slide your zipper all the way up to the top there. You're going to have the fold of your fabric right up against those teeth as closely as you can get. And you're just going to pin it in place. This is a very slow and careful step. You want to make sure you are not easing in or stretching your fabric to the zipper. I know you're thinking, Judy, this is a woven, it doesn't stretch. But they absolutely can stretch. And if you do stretch your fabric here, you're going to get a wavy zipper. And you're not going to like the way that looks along your bum. So if you're a beginner, or if your fabric is a little trickier, it's not holding a press, you're having a hard time getting it to look nice, iron 1 inch of interfacing, just a little strip of interfacing along the center seam. Then it will hold a press better, and it will not allow you to stretch your fabric as you are putting your zipper in. Okay. I still do this if my fabric has any kind of stretch to it, or if it doesn't hold a press. This corduroy and this lining were both super easy to work with. They both held a press very nicely and had zero stretch at all. And so I wasn't worried about it with this one, but I often will still use that interfacing along this back seam to make sure that I don't get a wobbly zipper, because nobody likes the wobbly zipper, especially along your booty, like this back seam. Not that you would particularly want a wobbly zipper on your side either. You just continue to pin on both sides. Once again, this is a super slow step. You want to take your time with this. Listen to your favorite music, audiobook, podcast, TV show, whatever it is, and just kind of zone out while you are being meticulous here. But you know what? You're almost done here too. So take your time, get it nice and perfect. I'm going to speed up the rest of this because it's just me doing the same thing really slowly and carefully. One thing that I do recommend is always checking it from the underside as well. You're pinning both the main and the lining, so you want to make sure that both are looking exactly how you want it to, right? You don't want to just pay attention to the main and then look from the underside and see that your lining is totally off. This bottom corner is the trickiest to me. I do unzip and zip up my zipper a couple of times while I'm doing this just to double check, get it perfect. You can see I'm unzipping it here, moving it around, zipping it back up, unzipping it. Just keep going until it's absolutely perfect for you. Or you know what? Perfect enough for you. How about that? All right, I'm happy with this. What I'm going to do is change out my regular foot for my zipper foot. Well, I'm going to hit the phone tripod one more time just for good measure. Always, y'all. I like to stitch along the right side of my zipper, so I'm going to put my zipper foot on, and then I'm going to move my needle to the center. I also love to pull up my bobbin thread before I start. I just think it gives it a better chance at starting off really nicely and cleanly. And now we're going to take off. You can stitch wherever you would like, as closely or as far. I like to stitch rather closely. I feel like it makes it nice and secure. I don't like my zipper to get stuck on any fabric kind of folded over too far. So I stitch really closely, probably about 1/8 of an inch. I just put my zipper foot as close as I can to those zipper's teeth, if you can see. And I'm going to stitch down one side, across the bottom, and then up the other side. And then we're going to be done. Go nice and slowly here though. This is something where you can't see the lining. Unless you hand basted that lining, it could very easily kind of move around. Once you get to the bottom, you are going to have to zip up your zipper just a little bit. I often grab my seam ripper just to use as another finger because I can get it in there a little bit easier than my own fingers. You're just going to have to zip it up past the foot. Here we go. And then to stitch that last little inch or so on the zipper. I always mark where that zipper stop is so that I'm not stitching over it. Again, I like to start my stitching just above the zipper stop, so I don't want to stitch on the zipper stop, so I go down just below the zipper stop, stitch across, and then back up. Once we stitch a couple of inches right here, we can move our zipper back down and opening it up. I always think it's a little bit easier to stitch when it's open versus closed personally, so I do most of my stitching with my zipper open. You might prefer your zipper closed and only barely zip any of it open, whichever way you like. We're almost done here. Be careful pressing at the end. Remember that your zipper is made of nylon and nylon will melt. So do not press this zipper with a high heat or you will melt your nylon zipper. we're all done. The only other thing you have that you need to do is trim your threads right here. And then also, if you would like to top stitch along your bottom hem, you can. It's fully lined, so it's completely optional. You don't need to stitch here. Again, be careful pressing if you have a nylon zipper like me. But you can stitch along the bottom if you would like. One thing that I normally do is I usually top stitch along the slit. The slit is the only area where the main fabric doesn't wrap around to the underside, and I never like my lining to peek out, and so I usually top stitch just this little triangle up, down, just right there. Otherwise, you're all done. I hope you love your Sophia pencil skirt, and I hope you feel like Sophia Loren. Bye, y'all.